I'm James Taylor, and you're listening to the SuperCreativity Podcast, a show dedicated to inspiring creative minds like yours. Today's guest is Dr. Anna Abraham, a neuroscientist, educator, mythbuster, and the E-Paul Torrance Professor at University of Georgia. She leads the Creativity and Imagination Lab and directs the Torrance Center for Creativity and Talent Development. Anna's work sits at the intersection of brain science and human imagination. She studies mental time travel, the boundary between fact and fiction, self-referencing thought, and how creativity works in our minds. Her latest book, The Creative Brain, Myths and Truths, pulls back the curtain on beliefs we hold about creativity. Ones like the right brain myth, the tortured artist stereotype, or that psychedelics are a shortcut, and shows the truths underneath. If you've ever doubted your creative potential because you believed a myth or wondered how science can illuminate what actually helps creativity, then this episode is for you. Anna, welcome to the SuperCreativity Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So Anna, what was your earliest encounter with a myth about creativity?
Earliest, that's a good one. Probably my own. I got into I've always been fascinated by creativity, but the first time I got the chance to study it was during my PhD. And the main impetus of my study was to try and figure out the link between creativity and mental illness. That was my starting point. And it's one of I'd call them myth truths is the way I kind of handle them in the book, of what is really the link between creativity and mental illness. And it's probably the oldest one of all of them because it's existed since sort of the ancient Greeks thought about it. So that's probably the oldest that I have encountered and really been thinking about for decades now.
And I wonder, with a myth like that, obviously we have these different myths that have in society, and the media, it seems to be one that the media often latch onto. The young rock star that dies of a overdose, for example. So let's do some myth bustings in this episode. Yeah. What is that? Is there a link, first of all? And if so, what is that link between this?
So the interesting thing about the myth truth of creativity and mental illness is that there is a link, but it's not really clear what the directionality is, how strong it is. When we think about creativity and madness or mental illness, saying it that broadly is obviously a myth. But when we look closer, there are certain types of disorders that are more associated with it. And there are lots of ideas about why that is. Some are sort of saying, well, when you're trying to be creative, you're exploring the unknown, you're taking a lot of risks, it's quite vulnerable to try and come up with new ideas that may or not be accepted by the larger collective. So it's the business of risk taking and potentially getting things wrong, or even if you're getting things right, it may not be actually recognized by others. So you're in a vulnerable position very often. Depending on the kind of creative activity it is, it can be a kind of isolating experience. So if you think about writers, they tend to be more at risk for a lot of mental disorders. They're the most at-risk group. And if you sort of just think about what does it take to write a work of fiction, for instance, it's months and months and months, or years sometimes, of being alone with your thoughts, trying to get it out there. And really, the most I think. The tricky part is you can't force yourself to come up with those lines. They have to kind of come out of you. So a lot of it is pretty unpredictable. So you're dealing with a lot of precarity at all levels, from the creation side on one hand, and then the other side, which you have almost no control, which is, will people accept it? Will people like it? Will it bring me my bread and butter? Will I achieve renown through it? And so on. So that's the difficulty with the creative experience. You're putting yourself out there. You're trying to do something that's unusual, stand out in some way. You can't count on it coming in a predictable way. So there's precarity at that level, precarity at the level of what you're creating, and then precarity at the level of it being accepted. So precarity across these levels is associated with greater vulnerability. You're much more likely to be more anxious then, and so on. And if things don't quite work out, there's only so much negative feedback you can get without it really affecting you. And the final thing I would say is also that creative professions as such are also associated from an socioeconomic standpoint, a lot of precarity. It's the kind of position that's not seen as often associated with full-time employment. We saw it at the time of the COVID pandemic. The first jobs to get hit was the food industry and the creative industry, right? Because everything just shut down. So there's also sort of socioeconomic precarity there. All of these things are vulnerability factors when it comes to mental illnesses. So that's what I mean by we don't know whether it is the process of pushing yourself out there, creating something that is a vulnerable space to be in. Is it also just the situation of being a creative person in the world as it is set up now, that where there's a lot of unsteadiness in your profession? What is it that leads to it? It might be a combination of both, of course, but so we know that's related to certain forms of mental illness, but we don't know which way it goes, or perhaps it's just way more complicated than we think it is. But so to just say that there's a link is somehow not satisfying, because it seems to say like, oh, if you do it, you're going to be more mentally ill, or the other way around. That's not true at all. There's lots of people who have all sorts of problems in terms of their mental health and well-being that don't go on to do anything creative. And there are lots of people on the other side who are pretty stable. So it's not an all or none phenomenon. And the more interesting story for me is to try to think about what is it about the act of creating, or what is it about the environment you're creating, and that pushes our vulnerabilities in a specific way.
It's nice, 'cause sometimes I remember when I was first getting interested in this, and you're reading like the Cambridge Handbook of Creativity, and you're reading all these other books and all these wonderful books about creativity, and it almost felt like there was two camps. There was the kind of Elizabeth Gilbert, Julia Cameron kind of woo-woo in a nicer sense. I can say that as someone that's lived in California, but I love part of that. But it was a very emotional, kind of almost spirit type of energy way of thinking about things. And then there was the neuroscience folks and the kind of brain science that kind of were trying to bring it down to almost the singular. So you mentioned that one myth, and in the book, The Creative Brain, you kind of lay out these 7 in total, these myths as well. What made you want to write this particular book? Because you have so much experience in this area. You could have written probably about 20 different books on creativity. Why was this the book that you felt compelled to write?
Well, the 19 are going to come as well, but this is the first one to come out. Well, first of all, when one gets to a certain level of being a creativity neuroscientist, and I don't know if this is true of all of us in the field, but certainly for me, when I started to do a lot more public engagement events, speaking to the general public, I started to notice when you get away from your community and you're speaking to people who don't have a great curiosity about creativity, which I think I've never met anyone who's not, and have a lot of notions about what it is. And something started to consistently come out as things that people held to be true, such as the creativity mental illness link, the link between the right brain and the creativity, psychedelics and creativity. And there was something else that fascinated me, not just the questions, but that even if you told people, well, it's not that simple, well, it's not that, well, it's a little more complicated, it didn't seem to satisfy a person's need to know what that was. And I thought, and that actually made me even more interested. Okay, I'm sure they've heard a lot of myth busting from a lot of people. I'm not the first person to do myth busting when it comes to creativity, but it just falls flat. It doesn't seem to take hold. And I was very interested in why that was. So the book, I think, was trying to make a case for, let's examine, I picked 7 myths about the creative brain, myth truths, I was always referring to it as, about the creative brain, to think we have these specific notions. Let's see how they started. Let's do an archival trawl, so to speak. When did they start? What do we know about it? And what is the best way to understand it? To sort of not see it as a black and white issue, it's right or wrong, it's myth or truth, but to essentially come to the conclusions I did in every single one of them, which is that every myth has a kernel of truth in it. And it's about how the story gets told that it becomes flattened and like one-dimensional in the telling of the tale. But if you actually explore the stories, it's really interesting what you learn about creativity and how people came to these assumptions about why this works in this particular context. Why do psychedelics work sometimes but not other times? Our story-making brain is such that we highlight the things that work, not the things that don't work. Things that don't work are kind of boring, right? So there's something about our need for storytelling that it's not enough for us to tell people or for people to be satisfied and say, well, that's not the case, but we don't really know. Nobody wants a don't know. They'd rather go with this is close enough or it feels good enough, because I know when one of the big questions I always get is children are so creative, grown-ups grow out of it. And I'm thinking, why do you think that way? And they're like, well, let's say all 8-year-olds draw, almost no 28-year-olds draw, right? So they're coming from a place of like sort of lived experience. They don't see it around them. They see a lot of children doing a lot of creative, fun things. They don't see adults do it. So it's very difficult to misplace that notion and say that's not actually true, that adults in general are not creative, because it doesn't. And if I don't have a better story to offer in place, they're going to cling to the thing that's based on what they think to be true or what they know from their own experience or what someone else influential has told, or, influential, I don't know, critic or whatever has told them. So that's the interesting thing about why it's almost a story. It's almost a book almost about why we like these stories. Because a lot of these explanations are pretty magical, and there's something about creativity that is so impressive, of course. So fills us with awe and wonder that we also want explanations that kind of feed, are representative or worthy of this thing that you're trying to explain. So we like outlandish explanations more than sort of boring stuff. So that's what the book explores, a little bit about what the myths are, why we think this way, and to get a sense of what the human brain does in terms of why it makes us want good, fun stories over truth. We like the poetic truth more than the real truth, so to speak.
So one of those ones that we often hear, people come up to you, if I'm on a plane and say, what do you do? And I said, I speak about creativity, innovation, AI. And they say, oh yeah, I'm really left brain, or I think I'm really more right brain. So this is one of the myths that you myth truths that you kind of talk about in the book. So tell us this whole right brain thing when it comes to creativity, is there a kernel of truth in that?
There certainly is. It's a very old story. It's one of the myth truths that was birthed at the time when a lot of exciting work was happening in the neurosciences that were focused on hemispheric lateralization, and it was very clear that from patients with certain types of atypicalities who had to have certain types of surgery that severed communication between their left hemisphere and the right hemisphere to sort of solve the problem, or at least make intractable epilepsy a thing of the past. There were these sorts of surgeries that needed to be done. It was really strange that people were almost like completely themselves, even though this major surgery had happened where large sections of their white matter tracts that allow for the left and right hemisphere to communicate with each other in a way that's really fast and efficient. There are other tracks through which they can do that, but it's a little slower. That people tend to be fine. And then when they did these sort of clever experiments, became really clear that the left hemisphere was so important for all sorts of functions, right? So let's say the throne of glory went to the left hemisphere when it came to things like intentional actions, language, and so on, and because we're human beings and we use language a lot, we think of it as sort of defining our species in very specific ways. And so a really weird thing happened in that the right brain began to be attributed everything that was not, goal-directed, everything that was more passion, thoughtlessness, everything else, almost as a sort of, there must be an area that does this because there are people who are not as rational and so on. So the right brain started to get to be seen as like, it doesn't seem to be that important for the things that really matter, logic, communication, and analytical ability. And then came along the idea that it was the right brain had something of worth, came from the original team, the Roger Sperry team, who found out about hemispheric lateralization differences. And I think it was because one member of that team, so it came from the group that was very respected as opposed to some random person, saying, well, when it comes to creative acts, and again, he didn't really have the data for it. He was very, very articulate person. He said essentially that, why am I blanking on his name? I am blanking on his name right now. But he said, and which is unforgivable. I'm sorry for that. But he I don't know
Is
why
that
I'm like,
which is maybe that's the part where the right part is a memory. Maybe that's what it is. That's why we're going
it's
that way. Short-term
it's
memory.
deteriorating in real time. Well, what he said was like, what he said was that the right and the left are both important, and the right is really important for certain aspects of the creative process, such as when you work away from the problem, the incubation stage, and so on. He never said that the left is not important. All he said was that the right brain being delegated as this nothingy hemisphere is incorrect, and it plays a big role in creative ideation. And so, of course, he's not wrong, because if you do fMRI studies, for instance, and so on, that you usually find both hemispheres involved in some way. Depending on the type of task, you might see more left or right, depending on if it's verbal or if it's a figural task, and so on. But that sort of revolutionized a lot, that understanding that the right brain is really important potentially for creative functions. Again, he didn't really have a lot of data to show this, but it didn't really matter. That was enough, and over time it went from, in no time it went from the right brain is important to the right brain is the seat.
Yeah.
But none of the people who were talking about the importance of the right brain ever said that the left brain is not, has no role. Just over time that became the sort of, because it was neglected, let's give it a spotlight. The good thing about having that happen, even if it's not particularly correct, is that it led to real changes in the way curriculums were designed, for instance, because people thought, well, let's cater to both sides of your mind.
Be a more holistic education system.
Let's not just make everything abstract about something written on a board. Let's think of it as visual and auditory, and let's try and work with more multimodally in the classroom to reach out to students, particularly those with issues, right? Have issues concentrating, have issues perhaps even with learning, and so on. And so over time, the whole right brain, left brain thing, I think at this point, it doesn't even matter if it's right or wrong. It serves a purpose as a metaphor, So if you and I were to want to do a collaboration together, and we spoke to some company, it wouldn't matter to the company what's right or wrong. If I say, well, we want to engage in more right brain thought, they immediately get it. It's because this metaphor, it's just now the way we think about things. So it has become powerful because it's important, but not because it has any particular truth value in its extreme form, but because it essentially caused a revolution in the way we think about human thought. And so it's become that placard for a more imaginative style of thinking, means engaging the right brain in some way, as opposed to this left brain, logical brain in some way.
But there is also, even within that, let's say, there's this kind of plasticity within that. I remember reading years ago, some patients with forms of dementia or Alzheimer's, as they get further into their disease, as it attacks different parts of the brain, suddenly they become a little bit more creative. They start to paint, and it kind of, they're a little bit to the point where they maybe start to take off all their clothes, which can go a little bit maybe too far. But so what's going on? That can't be killing the right brain. That just must be going for different things in the brain.
Yeah. First of all, it's Joseph Bogan is the name of the man who started this.
We got there.
Thank you.
We'll put a link to Joseph as well.
Joseph Bogan, yeah. So in the case of neurodegenerative disorders and many others, I explore that in another chapter, actually, because it's more than just the right brain, left brain thing. You see this interesting phenomenon in certain types of dementia, like frontotemporal dementia, where it was, I think, first properly studied in the mid-90s. It started, where they noticed that not all patients with frontotemporal dementia, which is essentially characterized by the atrophying of the most anterior portions of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. Yeah, so the frontal pole and the temporal pole gradually start to deteriorate, and depending on which area is more affected, there are different types of subtypes of frontotemporal dementia, or FTD. In a subset of these patients, they noticed something really strange. In a subset of them, even though they had no prior artistic training or actually any particular interest in the arts, this small subset, but sizable, you keep seeing this again and again and again, they develop an incredible interest in the arts and start to engage and practice in the arts. It's primarily visual art, but have been some cases of musical as well, and just a few of literary arts, but it's primarily in the visual domain. So it becomes like it's not just a passing interest, it becomes almost a compulsive interest in wanting to engage more and more in it, and it becomes everything that they do. So a lot of these patients, perhaps they can't go back to what they were doing before, but start to spend a lot of time painting, sketching, doing things like that.
Is that also because maybe other parts, language, other parts have been closed down, so they're looking for, almost like the brain's trying to rewire, trying to find an outlet for that that's already within that person?
That's a great observation. That's exactly what Dalia Zadel from UCLA, who studies this phenomenon of de novo creativity, would say it is that as human beings, you really have a sort of powerful drive to express yourself and to communicate. And so when your most obvious form of communication, which is to speak or write, shuts down, that need to express, to communicate, to be yourself in some way is still there. That drive is still there. And so it becomes, let's say, operationalized through these other mediums that you weren't necessarily particularly exposed to. But after some point, that becomes your only way, because very often in these types of situations, the ability to understand, produce language just slowly diminishes over time. And this continues all the way till the end.
So the thing that inhibits that, I'm wondering, so why anyone, you don't have to get dementia or forms of Alzheimer's to kind of go there. I'm wondering, like, my father's a jazz musician, a jazz guitarist, and I noticed something with great jazz musicians and comedians, they are almost able to switch something off in their brain that you and I probably have all the time, which says, don't do that, don't say that. It's almost like it's like a train where suddenly all the paths are open and they can just go, for good or for bad, because sometimes it can take them down tracks that they can't figure out how to get out of. But is also like what's kind of going on there, and this creativity in general? Is that something that we over time we can learn to kind of switch off, to switch on, or is it something that's just what's kind of going on? Is it a chemical thing? What's happening?
It's a good question. I think it's not studied in the lab and so on as much, because it's impossible to. It's so
in the moment.
It's so unpredictable. Things that are unpredictable are very hard to study in neuroscientific labs. But as you've just mentioned, if you have any contact with people who are in the business of producing creative acts and so on, that's part of who they are. They have learned with time. For one thing, what's really common to all creative people that I've met and I've read about, and we live in an age where you can read so many interviews of all these incredible achievers, they all differ in terms of their particular practices. But what they do have in common is that they're all incredibly reflective and curious about their own minds and how they operate. Yeah. So they have what you see is this metacognitive ability is what they have in common. They're really curious about how they do it. There are these great interviews with Pat Metheny, who's tries to improvise on a nightly basis, it seems, or something. And he writes extensive notes because he's very interested in getting into the flow state. Just because someone's trying to improvise and be that doesn't mean they're always doing what they think is the absolute pinnacle of what they can achieve. They seem to be doing great and we listen to it and it's wonderful. But for them, each person has a certain bar. And to get into that state is a little bit outside their control, but they know the conditions that are more likely to lead to it. The person who's talked a lot about this, rather well about it, not a lot perhaps, is John Cleese, actually. Yeah. When he talks about he's got a little creativity book out that came out, I think, 2 years ago. But he has this very famous lecture now online that he has delivered in the 90s to like a business crowd. And he identifies conditions that you create. And I think this is what I think all creative, like people who are in the business of trying to be, it's either their profession or they love to do it, whatever it might be, recognize that they need to shift something intentionally about the way their minds are going down. Because our minds, our mind brains, if you want, essentially work on the principle of the path of least resistance, right? So if you want to get out of your room now, you're not going to take a zigzag path. You're going to go straight to it. That's just automatic. It's what you're going to do. And that's because our brains are that way. We're just not going to do things that are unnecessary. This is not a problem in our daily life. This is absolutely excellent for our daily lives. When it comes to creativity, though, going down the path of least resistance means going to the same boring space. So you have to essentially disrupt these pathways, these normal pathways that you're on. And most creative people have some way of disrupting their own ability to take the easy way out. And they do it in a number of different ways. And so someone like John Cleese points out, for instance, as a writer, what you need to do, you need to sort of try and get into the open mode, the space where it's more playful, it's a little bit, it's zany and so on. But essentially, you have to create a space-time kind of, what does he call it, a space-time oasis, where you understand that there's going to be that voice that tells you don't do this, don't do that, but actually just wait for it to die down. Yeah. And then engage. When I had the opportunity to try and do some workshoppy things with some really eminent creatives, composers, writers, and so on, I tried to disrupt some things for them. And I remember one of the feedback I got was just sort of like, had this work for you? They're like, well, you could have made it really hard for us and we would have still managed to step out of it and do what we do, because we literally have to train for this, to just break away from the path of least resistance. If there's noise in the area around you, you still have to work through it. If you have a deadline, you have to get this composition done by then. You have to finish your writing by then. You can't create a perfect, there'll be lots of situations where you know that something is going to disrupt your ability to do it. And even in like high performance athletes, this is sort of like why they will do a lot of visualization, to try and visualize all of the possible things that could go wrong here or change, and differ from what you've trained for. At least visualize it so that you can get down that different path. So it is definitely to say it's chemical would be probably too basic, but it's a behavioral, it's a cognitive behavioral sort of top-down thing you do that just blows things apart. And that can come to you easily when you're with enough practice.
You were mentioning John Cleese. I was doing an event actually in Stockholm in Sweden, and I was staying at a hotel, and I bumped into him because he was staying in the same hotel. And
oh, wow.
Actually we had a conversation. I was asking him about that, and one of the things I remember he said, maybe on one of the well-known videos or something else I'd seen him, was this idea of like a lens, focusing and defocusing, and something I'll often talk, and I've delivered this. I've mentioned this in Bogota in Colombia, and I thought they were going to kill me on stage when I said it. But there was some great work by Martha Farrar, neuroscience professor from the University of Pennsylvania, where she said she discovered that high levels of caffeine coffee will reduce the number of insights that you have. And what I was explaining to the audience, I said, there's nothing wrong with caffeine. Coffee's great. And I use it for like the preparation stage, and I'll use it for the last stage, like when you're building something. But often in these middle stages, like going back to the John Cleese thing, you actually want to defocus your brain. Yeah. And caffeine works exactly in the opposite use. And when you tell business audiences that, they go, I get it. But what I know, and I don't know, because you have the joy of speaking to all these students every day, and they're lit up, and often the audience I speak to, and I love speaking to, are very grounded business audiences that are thinking about KPIs and, pharmaceutical companies or whatever the company is. And so my job is to go there and make the case for creativity in an audience that might not necessarily think that there's great value. Maybe the advertising department or the marketing. So I'm normally going in, speaking to very technical people, mechanics, chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, for example. And one thing I have to do at the very start is I have to define what I mean by this word creativity, because in the language we often hear it's like artistic or music. I say, well, that's not what I'm talking about here. That is important. I'm talking, for me, and the definition I give, which is one of many, I guess, creativity is about bringing new ideas to the mind. Innovation is about bringing new ideas to the world. But without creativity, there is no innovation. Creativity is the engine of innovation. So once you're going to get them on that, the other one that often they're surprised at is that creativity is a a teachable or a trainable skill, like a language, something can be improved upon. And the thing, kind of coming back to the work that you do, I talked to them about the Torrance Test,
Yeah.
and I could have measured all of your creative levels when you came in today using something called the Torrance Test, and I'll do a workshop with you, and at the end we could measure your creative, and we'll see it increase. So, and a lot of people are really shocked that there is something that actually that this is a measurable thing. So we should probably first, like, you are at the Torrance Center, so we should probably describe first of all who is Torrance, and we're thinking about creativity. What is this Torrance Test, and does it still hold up today?
Yeah. Yes, so I'm at the University of Georgia, and my position is of the Paul Torrance Professor. Upon his retirement in '86, his graduate student founded the Torrance Center for Creativity. Torrance was educational psychologist, and he realized, and for those of us who aren't necessarily in education, he realized that something was not being focused on at all when it came to child development and the development of children's skills, which was creativity. People focused on math, on language, science skills, and so on, but there was very little focus on creativity, and he was sort of prescient in realizing that this was something that was really necessary in the time. And so when he started to do on this kind of work in the 50s and the 60s, the 1950s and the 1960s, and again, very prescient of him. He was very aware of that was kind of the golden age of, from the 50s on till the 70s, maybe, creativity research, just a huge amount of impetus of work there. And he was very much in touch with all of those theories, and I think spoke extensively to all of the big people in the field there. And what he recognized was that for education, the field of education, in practice, to take something seriously, you're going to have to devise a test, because you have to be able to create something measurable so that they know, okay, we can target something, we can see a skill, and we can see it develop. So again, very prescient in realizing that, it's great what the psychologists do in terms of like coming up with tasks and assessing creativity, but he took it a step further to say, I'm going to devise a test for creativity, just like you have a test for anything else. And it's still in use. It gets re-normed every 10 years. The last norming happened just last year. And so it's all constantly updated. And he had a range of tests, of which only 2 are really widely used now, because they have a lot more predictive value than the others. And that one is the verbal test, and the other one is the figural test. So things like the one sounds and movement and all are not really used as much, not for the testing of creativity. Certainly, you could use them for the engagement of the creative imagination in a big way, to use in classrooms and so on. But so the test is still in use. It's used very widely in the United States and some other parts of the world, Turkey, not in South Korea, and so on, where there is a huge amount of focus on creativity as one of the many traits that might distinguish highly capable children from others who are less capable.
I think Singapore, I seem to remember, were very big into, because obviously the PISA rankings, all these countries are obsessed about reaching the top of the PISA rankings.
Yes, and speaking of PISA, PISA's last variant of PISA essentially added a new component, which was critical and creative thinking. So it's now part of the PISA measurements as well, to assess creative thinking. When you said Singapore and PISA, I was like, yeah, because Singapore is part of that.
Many of these tests, then, they're measuring like basically what we think of like divergent and convergent thinking, your ability to do these different ways.
So I think what we have to be very careful about is, like, a lot of these tests, they measure very specific aspects of creativity. So there's some things that you can't measure through those test batteries because it involves, let's say, engaging in a creative practice in real time. It doesn't test for flow. It can't, because you have to be doing something to be engaged in flow. And you can ask about something retrospectively, which a lot of flow questionnaires do. So there's lots of things there that can't be tested in that format. But the things that they do look at are your ability to think, come up with a lot of different ideas, think divergently, think beyond the obvious, beyond the path of least resistance. And the focus is really on children more than adults, because that's kind of was this population, especially because the norming goes from goes across childhood to adulthood, but doesn't continue after that. Like a lot of tests, it doesn't matter when if you're 18 or 24, how you perform on on a test, but there'll be a big difference depending on whether you're 10 or 15, right? So,
but I think for a lot of these business audiences, they kind of go, oh, okay, realize, like, where can I do this test? And so then I tell them, go online, they can take this test. The other one, which I'm not sure if you kind of spoke so much about in the book, but kind of links, it's almost the historical thing you spoke about at the start, and I call it this myth of the lone creative genius. This is. And I think it works very well because most large organizations are, creativity is collaborative in most work. And one of the things I sometimes do, a friend of mine, Frederick Harron, who's a wonderful speaker, speaks on creativity as well. He asked audiences at the start, how many people you consider yourself to be creative? And he said, depending if I'm speaking in America or Europe or South Korea, it's going to be vastly different. Where it tends to be in Asia, and especially South Asia, they tend to vote lower. And one of the things that I often talk with audiences about is this idea of this lone creative genius test, which you said at the start, it's a good narrative. It's great. And then and you'll be able to kind of probably correct me on this, but the one my understanding of where a lot of that kind of came from, if you go back in many societies, it was always felt that we were vessels for creativity. That could come from the genius loci, as the Romans would call it. The places themselves had their own creative genius, or community, or your tribe. And then a guy called Giorgio Vasari wrote a book, Lives of the Artists in the Renaissance, and he said, no, Leonardo is the genius. It's not that he has genius, but by doing that, he kind of painted out all the contribution of the Medicis, the sponsors, the supplies of all the equipment, all the assistants as well. So is this lone creative genius? Is that something that kind of comes up, or is it really a substrand of like something, this kind of myth that we often talk about?
Yeah, I think a lot of the people who've worked a lot on that are people like, Simonton, Dean Keith Simonton, and people like that. So it's
more cultural, isn't it? I guess more than it necessarily is.
Yeah, I think it's just in a time where I think a lot of the time you have to think about, okay, what were they alone by choice? There certainly are people who are alone when they did it, or is it just not available? Like we live in a hyper-connected world, so a hyper-social world. So it's very hard to imagine the kind of person who would be sort of isolated in some little room.
The Zen master sitting on a mountain somewhere in Japan,
but it's there, right? Like there are certain type of fields for which that sort of solitariness is absolutely key to I would say it's not that it's a myth that it's there. It just depends on what type of creativity you're talking about, what field. So I would say in the field of math, there's a lot of silent sitting around doing your thing, focusing very much on your task at hand. In writing, there's a lot of that. In music, there is not. There's a lot of it really involves a huge set of people, and increasingly more and more now as productions get more complex. In writing, if you're writing a novel alone or a poem, that's a solitary thing. If you're writing for a show, there's a lot of group writing. So it just depends on the context, and some context. An athlete trying to get better and better, there's parts of it that's going to be very isolating, very, very themselves on their own, trying to hone their techniques, and others that demand that you are working with other people to hone your skills, to be able to react better and so on. So I think of this lone versus not lone question as a bit sort of like, well, it kind of depends. The answer for me is a little bit banal because it depends on what you're trying to do. There are situations in which we would always say you need to get away and get into yourself. And there are others, and it might be doing the same process, and then other parts where you have to exchange. So in a scientific lab, there are parts where you're away and other parts where you're exchanging with others. And as they say, exchange is oxygen, right? Like I forget who said that, but there is no one path and I think anyone who would sort of put forward that there's one path to being creative is going to necessarily be wrong. There are, if anything, many, many routes. If you are going to be entirely on your own, it doesn't mean that you can't be creative. Of course you can. Yeah.
I always wanted to have a T-shirt. I always wanted to have a T-shirt, and you would so I could go to these demonstrations about something. So someone was like very like fixed about this is the right way, and another group was like, no, this is the right way. And I always wanted to have a T-shirt which just said, I think you'll find it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Please make that one.
So if anyone wants to make a T-shirt, because it is. But what I mean, you're teaching, you're around, like lots of educated people, you're incredibly smart women. But what is the most pervasive myth of all these myths that you share in the book? What is the most pervasive myth, even amongst people that you think probably should know better?
I wouldn't say any one. I think a lot of the problem of how people approach creativity, and I think I will count it as a myth, is that they see creativity on one hand as this magical thing that they don't or don't have. And like, please give me a bullet. Can I take psychedelics and then become more creative? So there's a real lack of understanding, I think, of what it is. And that's primarily because our notions of creativity are very much based on what we think of as creative. And for some of us, we will be looking at musicians. For others among us, we will be looking at authors and so on. But just like people who are very famous. And that gives you a very skewed understanding of what creativity is. For me, the biggest myth is a lot of our notions about what creativity is are mythical or not completely correct because it's based on exceptional creativity. People who've done things that are incredibly important for their fields and have received the recognition for it, which is like the top 5%. But there is creativity that is most of the things that are more interesting about creativity for everyday regular people is based on, I would say, is general creativity, everyday creativity. And those things there look slightly different, actually. And so that I think is the main reason why they're so mistaken about what creativity is. And the second thing is, I would say, related to that is that people looking at exceptionality think, oh, exceptionality, that came to them easy, they're talented. All of that is all wrong, by the way. People at that stage have had to work so hard. And so part of looking at things that look amazing and otherworldly makes us think that this comes to people easily. They've not had to work hard. And the other side is the unglamorous part of creativity is where the real truth is, which is that it's a craft. You have to keep working at it. It's actually better to think of it as akin to physical fitness. That, we never tell people, well, don't bother running because you can't run as fast as Usain Bolt. Like, that's exceptional physical prowess. What we're looking at is like normal physical fitness, and it's good for me to try and run a little bit, even though I'm not going to be the fastest, right? And so that's the way to think about creativity is as more like your own creative fitness is about pushing yourself, but only doing things makes you understand what you are uniquely capable of. And that's where creativity is. A lot of bad focus on creativity, I think, comes from thinking of creativity as externally determined. Only if someone recognizes that I'm creative, am I being creative. That's also very separate from what you create, what you come up with, because that's the starting point. The starting point is not how someone else sees it. The starting point is actually what you come up with. So there's just, for me, it's hard to pick on one because there are so many terrible notions we have about creativity that come from a very skewed understanding of looking at a distinct few. And we think about it as more simple than it is, if you see what I mean.
The one I often think about is when someone says of someone who's very, they're doing an amazing job, whatever their field is, you're such a natural. It's so natural. And I think about someone like Nikki Glaser, who did the Oscars, I think it was last year, or the Emmys last year. And her performance, her opening monologue was so brilliant. But what people don't see is that she rehearsed that 87 times. She workshopped that 10-minute bit, so many times. And someone like Michael Caine said the practice is the work, the performance is the play, and the audience only ever see that tiny little bit at the front and go, it's so natural. It's obviously so natural, and I guess that, and it's a compliment because the person has put in those hours and it's made it like, I mean, I'm sure like when you write that book, that is just the smallest part of all that research, all those years you've spent studying as well. As we start to finish up here, I would love to know, we're going to talk about we're going to have links to your book and your work as well, but is there a book by another author just now that you've been, it could be related to creativity or even maybe a little bit broader than that, that's really made you kind of rethink this field that you're in, or it's just you've come at it and it's just kind of like a breath of fresh air, or you've just kind of reconsidered the world and the way you look at it in some ways? Is there a book that's been like that over the past year or so for you?
Book on creativity?
It could be on something else. Maybe obviously with your kind of wide academic side as well.
There are a few things. When it comes to a book on creativity, I would recommend The Active. Oh my God, no, we're gonna have to redo this. What's his name?
We'll put a link to it.
What's it called? Well, it's Rick Rubin's creativity book.
Oh yeah, it's called. It's what I know. It's got the circle on it, and that's I can see it now actually.
Yeah,
it's called. Yes, I know the one. I've blanked on it. The Creative Act.
Is that one? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I think that is for me. I found that just very intriguing. Because a lot of the time when you read interviews or the scientific work can get so divorced from what creativity is, that it felt wonderful sort of listening to a practitioner, someone who really is in the business of creativity, both being able to recognize, and like, of course, constantly being the business of listening to things that are new, completely new, and trying to figure out how it makes you feel and so on. So I just liked the whole experiential nature of how he focuses on the creative act and really makes a case for that internal over the external more than anything else, because the starting point. And I think very few books ever do that. So I think that would count, because that was maybe in the last year that I read it. And more recently, in preparation for a class that I'm doing, I started to read Bill Bryson's book called The Body. And that's been marvelous to really get a sense of how incredible the human body is and how little we know. And from what we, it's a nice sort of overview of all of our different systems and how much we think we know what we know and how much we get wrong, and how sort of the early pioneers in these fields, a lot of them were like absolute heroes who died in the cause, and then others are just disgusting specimens who stole their students' work. And it's just this wonderful sort of outlining of what it takes to build a field of knowledge, and all of the remarkable sort of little stories in there, including getting a sense of what our bodies are. So things like, fantastic. I don't know, the brain in your gut, right? Like gut brain. That was so like when I started as a neuroscience student, we weren't really taught this, but there's so much now that we know. So it's just wonderful to read that, to have read that, to get a sort of renewed appreciation of how remarkable our physiology is. This thing that allows us to be creative. It all starts from the body, from within you, and that's been wonderful to have that reignited again, that appreciation.
Great. We'll put those links here as well. And finally, if people want to learn more about you and your work, we're going to have a link to the Creative Brain. But if they want to learn more about the research, the other things that you're working on just now that over there in Georgia, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
Possibly my website is the best place, which is www.anna-abraham.com. That's where I keep things updated, but people can always email me if they have questions as well.
Well, Dr. Anna Abraham, it's been a pleasure having you on the Super Creativity Podcast. Thanks for being a guest.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
You can subscribe to the Super Creativity Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast. While you're there, leave us a review. I would really, really appreciate it. I'm James Taylor, and you've been listening to the Super Creativity Podcast.